Certainly another goal the United States consistently, then and now, has looked to Egypt to provide was to use its influence, certainly as a broker for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Here was the one, at that time, the one Arab country with relations both with the PLO and with Israel. And indeed, ever since, and including recently, we've seen Egypt take a very high-profile role. Just in this new century, Egypt hosted 2 summits in 2000 at Sharm el-Sheikh and Taba in an effort to resume the negotiations that were suspended in 2000 between Israel and the Palestinians. In 2003, President Hosni Mubarak hosted President Bush for another summit, and yet another summit was held at the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh in 2005, attended by Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians. Beyond, and most recently, and I'll get to this later, attempting to broker some kind of peace in Gaza, America has also looked to Egypt to provide pro-American Arab military muscle in the region, particularly in connection with Saudi Arabia and the Arab oil countries of the Gulf against Iran, and as a check on the military power and diplomatic power, I should say as well, of Syria, and at least until 2003 as a check on the power of Iraq. Part of this American interest in Egypt as a powerful military ally in the Arab world has been the integration of Egyptian forces within the U.S. Central Command. The so-called Bright Star exercises between Egyptian forces and American forces have been going on since 1983. And certainly the Gulf War in 1991 was probably a crowning achievement in showing the degree to which the 2 separate militaries could function together to pursue common aims. Certainly beyond that, the United States has looked to Egypt to keep the Suez Canal open as a flow for oil and other strategic supplies. And most recently has looked to Egypt to provide pro-American leadership in what President Bush has described as the war on terrorism. Certainly Egypt long has had its own problems with Islamic radicals, including, in fact, now after 9/11, some Islamic Egyptian radicals that the United States also has shared a concern with. People such as Sheikh Umar Abdurrahman, the blind sheikh currently in prison in the United States, Muhammad Atif, who prior to his death in Afghanistan in 2001 was the number 3 person in Al-Qaeda, and certainly Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is currently the number 2 person in Al-Qaeda. Indeed, Egypt has long had a concern with Islamic militants, and in fact the founders of modern-day Islamic politics, both above-ground politics and the violent underground, were Egyptians. The 2 most significant people anywhere in the Islamic world in the 20th century were Egyptians. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sayyid Qutb. Most people see him as the godfather, if you will, of violent Islamic politics. As part of the war on terrorism, the United States has authorized what has been called extraordinary rendition of terrorist suspects to Egypt as far back as 1995, prior to the Bush administration. The United States considered subcontracting, let's say, interrogation methods to Egypt as a country known for taking a somewhat harsher approach, shall we say, to those kinds of things. And indeed, those familiar with the lead-up to the Iraq War may remember that part of the so-called smoking gun case against Iraq was actually supplied to American intelligence agencies by a Libyan suspect named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who had in fact been rendered to Egypt, tortured, and later confessed that he had made up much of the so-called evidence against Iraq under torture. So that particular aspect of America's relationship with Egypt has backfired to some degree. As for the Egyptians, what did they seek out of a strategic relationship with the United States? What interest did they feel could be served by courting the United States instead of the Soviet Union? The joke was, the Egyptians are the jokesters of the Arab world, and there were a number of jokes about Sadat when he first came to power, because not many people in Egypt or abroad thought he would come to much. One of the jokes was about his proclivities, sort of left wing versus right wing, and the joke was that his driver took him out for a drive one day, and he came to this intersection, and he said, "CD," which is like, you know, boss or Mister, "which way do you want me to turn?" And Sadat said, "Well, how did President Nasser tell you to turn?" And he said, "Well, he would turn left, of course." So Sadat said, "Well, signal left, but turn right." Okay. So initially, many, including the United States, were uncertain whether Sadat was going to follow Nasser's policies of things he called Arab socialism, confrontation with Israel, and so forth, or whether, in fact, he was going to lean toward the United States. Sadat's main goal, and this has been a strategic goal of the Egyptian leadership ever since, including, indeed, especially under Hosni Mubarak, has been to secure aid, to secure financial assistance. Anwar Sadat, and certainly Mubarak after him, recognized that to de-Nasserize Egypt, to de-socialize, to open up the economy, to achieve the kind of economic development that Egypt needed would require an end to the war with Israel, which siphoned off a tremendous percentage of the Egyptian gross national product, and that only the United States would be able to, number one, bring about an Egyptian peace treaty with Israel, and number two, really only getting the United States on Egypt's side would enable it to acquire the foreign capital needed to get the economy moving. As Sadat famously said, America holds 99% of the cards as far as the Middle East. So indeed, from the Egyptian perspective, this strategic need has paid off, quite literally. The United States has provided Egypt with approximately $1.3 billion a year in military aid since 1979, and an average of about $800 million a year in economic assistance beyond that. In 1979, in fact, when this large amount of aid began flowing to Egypt, it constituted a full 5% of Egypt's gross domestic product. It's now less than a 0.5%. But at the time, it was a significant influx of capital that Egypt badly needed. All told, as some of you probably know, Egypt has received over $50 billion in American largesse since 1979, and for many years, in fact decades, after the peace treaty with Israel, Israel and Egypt were one and number two largest recipients of American foreign aid anywhere in the world. The beginning of a process that we still see going on now as far as the Palestinians, that is, peace with Israel in return for American money. Really, the precedent was set with Egypt. As I mentioned, this was not just military aid. USAID, the Agency for International Development, gives Egypt over $200 million a year. From 1975 to 2007, that amounted to about $28 billion. Which again was by far the largest amount of development aid given to any country in the world by the United States government. So both parties, the U.S. and Egypt, have had broad strategic needs that they have seen the other able to provide, and indeed have seen those needs met, a relationship seemingly made in heaven.